Hi, friends. I'm the author of Carl Jung Knowledge in a Nutshell, and I wanted to share a little bit about the book with you and Jung's cultural influence and why you should want to know more about him. My background is I grew up in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada, which you might recognize that shot of very few of you from the cover of Joni Mitchell's Clouds. And I was lucky to have a great public education and got to do the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, at 13. Then I went on to Vancouver to study at the University of British Columbia, Canada, and then moved to Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, a beautiful campus there, wonderful place to study or visit or go to a conference at. In 2011, I founded Jungian Online, which connects people that want to work with an analyst to work via video. A lot of people are in places where there isn't an analyst, or today, of course, everyone's working on video. But if you want to do that work and comfortable doing it on video, check out jungianonline.com. Recently, I founded Jung Academy, which is a teaching site where the people that are on Jungian Online are going to have their courses available to learn more about applying this work to your everyday life. And so sign up for the email list there to hear more about that. And in the book, I wanted to just read a few reviews that are great, and I'm really touched to see the wonderful reviews there. Um, This is one that says, I've been in Jungian analysis for nearly a decade and have been reading his works and other Jungians like Marion Woodman and James Hollis since in my 20s. This is the clearest, most easily understood introduction to Jungian psychology I've ever read. This book absolutely delivers. Another reader wrote, I have a collection of Dr. Carl Jung's work and author did the subject justice in everyday language. And I really appreciate that and makes me feel like I've done a good job. So thank you. So going into the book a little bit, there's the chapter list. So of course we get into the chapter 1, Jung's psychology, the basics, chapter 2, the shadow, and I'll take you through all these pretty much. But I want to get into a bit of Jung's cultural influence and tell you a bit about who he was so you can understand why you might want to read that book, especially if you're new to Jung. So he, of course, was Freud's heir apparent, and they had a split mostly over sexuality versus spirituality to very oversimplify, but to some extent, the gist of it. Freud really felt that all religion and creativity was repressed sexuality, and Jung felt that there was a spiritual impulse in people that was its own inner calling that needed to be heeded. And Jung's influence is huge. So the way we talk about dream interpretation, the way we talk about archetype, and of course personality type theory has been influenced by Jung, and he literally gave us the words introvert, extrovert, complex, synchronicity, collective unconscious. Those are all terms originated by Jung. So one of the things people don't understand is how much of Jung's own work he did. This is a painting that he did with a sort of a mandala figure in a tent. And Jung really took his own inner work seriously, not only as an inner exercise, but as something that he concretized in artistic form. So he would paint and carve and draw. And this part of the process is very, very important. So this is from the Red Book, which is original art by Jung that he was moved to create during his confrontation with the unconscious period. After his split from Freud, he was very lost and went into himself. And images like this powerful one you see here came to him, and he honored those images by representing them in physical work. And that's the thing that the psyche can't do. Psyche can't turn these images and make them physical, but we can. Can't bring them into the world, but we can. So here's what I write in the book. The images of the Red Book depict quite exactly what this experience was like for Jung. Seeing his artwork up close, one is struck by his dedication to the inner world. Art historian Jill Mellick observed that throughout it all, he gave primacy to the process and he valued direct inner experience. There's him carving, I think, the Orphan Stone at Bollingen. Making art allowed for Jung the ego to unfold what the ego resisted and discovered the power of creativity as healing work. With an attitude of play, Jung held the tension between the emergent inner voice and the ego. Out of the well held inner dialogue, something new emerges, a new understanding, a new attitude, or symbol. This is a carving of Loki that Jung did from an inner calling wood carving. Great author James Joyce brought his daughter to Jung, and Jung was, read by T.H. Lawrence and many other authors of his time, was extremely popular in his own era. And it came out in 2003 that Jung actually worked as a spy for the Allies during World War II and wrote psychological profiles of all the Axis leaders. And for Jung, the quote or the byline in the book says, for Jung, under the picture, Nazism represented a mass psychosis and demonstrated the potential dangers that culture could present. And Alan Dulles, who was the head of the OSS that later became the CIA, said, nobody will ever know how much Professor Jung contributed to the Allied cause during the war. And I think it was really clear that Jung understood the danger of evil in the collective psyche. And this is a very important thing because people tend to go unconscious around collective shadow. And we have to call it out and face it. It's not just an inner process. We face the shadow in the world, and by our naming it, we are initiated. It's kind of a Steiner paraphrase of a Steiner quote there. Jung corresponded with Bill W., the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that might be why you have the spiritual principle in AA, spiritual step. He was read by the literary giants of his day, as I said, and outsold Freud 2-1 the whole time. On the cover of Time, Valentine's Day 1951. And then we turn to the cultural influence again in pop. So, of course, the Police album Synchronicity, of course, based on Jung. And you'll see the red book behind Sting in a recent documentary that came out on Netflix. The Rolling Stones, Sympathy for the Devil, very Jungian shadow type song. And there he is on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. So Jung's ubiquitous throughout the 60s, of course, but not just in the 60s. And I'll read what I say about this in the book. Today, the international Jungian community is an organically growing worldwide phenomenon. Unexpected outgrowths of interest have popped up outside the English-speaking world. You may not be aware that Jung and Freud are very popular across South America. Both are taught in college, and analysis is commonly undertaken. In Asia, China recently hosted a conference attended by 3,000 people, and Korea has a Jung Institute of its own. Perhaps most remarkably, Jung's work bloomed anew in the creative expression of the popular K-pop band BTS. Their album Map of the Soul Persona was based on a book by Jungian analyst Murray Stein, and it explores their own struggles of identity. Their album was such a chart topper that it drove Stein's book back onto the bestseller list. So Jungian psychology, for me, Jung is tapped into something that's natural and wasn't so much, making up things that what he imagines a psyche about, but going in and meeting what he sees there. And that to me is why people of different cultures and different times can connect to this work and relate to it in their own way. In chapter 1, I look at the origin of terms like complex and where Jung's psychology started with the word association experiment that found a way to find autonomous complexes in the psyche based on the pause that people have in one form when they hear a certain word. I get into the definitions here of the unconscious, a layer of psychic functioning below the threshold of consciousness and the matrix out of which ego self-awareness emerges. Complexes and other centers of energy exist in the unconscious. Weltanschauung, the last term there, our attitude toward life, which contributes to our psychological health, is rooted both in the unconscious and the conscious mind. So I love that word, and just that Jungian analysis is about changing our attitude to life, and that's not so easily done. Chapter 2, we look at the shadow, perhaps the most commonly known concept of Jung's. Shadow, the inner split-off complex. that contains our rejected values. The shadow comes into being as a result of ego formation and contains positive and negative qualities. Of course, we say a lot more about that in the chapter, but a little taste of the key points. So this isn't in the book, but it's a great quote. Jung says, "I once knew an old lady who was very aristocratic and noble, who conducted her life according to the most exquisite ideas of refinement. But at night, she would dream about drunkenness, and in those dreams, she herself would become hopelessly intoxicated. And so one must be what one is. One must discover one's own individuality, that center of personality, which is equidistant between the conscious and the unconscious. We must aim for that ideal point towards which nature appears to be directing us. Only from that point can one satisfy one's needs." And so the whole process of doing this work is one that is built into nature that we're working with, that wants us to integrate things that are split within us. Uh, that's the function of the self that we're going to talk about momentarily. And one of the team members on Jungian Online, Jungian analyst Elizabeth Gomez, has a great quote that I include in the book. She says, I felt at first that acceptance of the shadow meant agreeing with those parts of myself. Gradually, I came to realize that it was not the case. Accepting and recognizing meant making those aspects of myself conscious. It did not mean necessarily liking them or condoning them, but accepting that they were there. So the shadow is this other within us, very often opposite the persona, um, and that we have to see it and accept it, even if it is the opposite of what our conscious self would like to see. Chapter 3, Inner Work. Of course, there's so much we could say about that. I open by saying that, sort of what is inner work? Jung did not see his psychology as primarily a collection of theories, but rather as an applied practice. Jungian psychology is something that we do. It's work to come into greater relationship with ourselves, to discover and relate to parts of ourselves beyond our regular conscious awareness. Listening to dreams is one definitive example of this practice. In dreams, we discover deeper voices living and active inside of us, but there are other ways to do this: journaling, creative artwork, active imagination, divination, observation of relationships, analysis, and psychotherapy. All these forms of practice seek to enable us to view the activity of the unconscious in our lives. So we look to those various forms to see what is moving through our unconscious. Okay, of course, dream interpretation and the interpretation of dreams is humanity's original form of interaction with the unconscious. From the biblical Jacob to the Epic of Gilgamesh, and throughout our indigenous traditions, we see demonstrations of our ancestors' curiosity about and respect for the wisdom of dreams. So it goes on from there. Some key points from that chapter. Wholeness, the state of increased integration of unconscious material into consciousness. The goal of analysis. Wholeness is often defined in contradistinction from perfection. So we're not trying to be perfect. We're trying to include all the parts of who we are to the extent we can. And it is a lifelong task, not something that's going to be done quickly. I'll talk about those terms again more at the end there. A little bit about culture. Culture generally serves the function of reforming our instincts in favor of moral action, but it can also normalize behavior that serves our lowest instincts and our worst selves. A desire to belong to one's tribe can lead people to perform horrific deeds, or heroic deeds, I guess, Freudian slip. And unconscious allegiance to authority can lead one to take part in atrocities. The drive to serve the tribe without question is also part of who we are. For these reasons, Jung felt that institutions should be regarded skeptically. Jung was definitely skeptical of collective institutions and groups. Chapter 4, the self, as I mentioned, that part of us that wants to bring these parts, the unconscious and the conscious, into relationship. And it's much like the nautilus shell that repeats its growth while preserving our inherent wholeness. This instinct to renew ourselves while keeping our integrity. The self is the blueprint of our potential unfolding and path to greater unity of conscious and unconscious within us. Jung sought perpetually reorienting us toward balance and guiding us in a greater wholeness. Like many of nature's systems, the psyche is self-regulating. And images of the self would include, for example, the mandala. Okay, a little bit from the book here. People will take on the spirit of the group and become identified with it, especially if they're identified with their persona. The persona-oriented individual is especially keen on saving face publicly and being seen in a good light. When the ego identifies with the persona, the subject's center of gravity lies in the unconscious. It is then practically identical with the collective unconscious. Because the whole personality is collective in these cases, the destruction of conscious ideals is feared. Here, the tribal vision provides strength and identity, and change will not be welcomed. So much we could say about that, but I try and give us some of these important pieces throughout the book. Great area of expertise of mine is personality types. Of course, Jung gave us extrovert, introvert, and the system that has developed into the MBTI later. Separation between sensing types and intuiting types, thinking and feeling types, different ways of making judgments about the world. We get into that. Okay, so in the world of dating and mating, the division between intuitive types and sensate types may be the hardest to overcome. This is because they simply perceive experience in opposite ways. Sensors see the plethora of fine detail that fills our experience of the outer world. Intuitives read between the lines and see the hidden possibilities. If they go to a party, the sensor will see the beautiful green taffeta dress, remember the little bit of cinnamon and the smell of the warm apple pie, and notice the newly painted wall. Meanwhile, the intuitive will get a feeling of that two friends are having sex on the sly, get a great idea for a new business idea, and notice the tense body language between a couple. In the song She's Your Lover Now, Bob Dylan has a line that sums up the vast gulf in communication expectations that can exist between a concrete sensor and the intuitive partner. He says, "Now you stand there expecting me to remember something you forgot to say." And that can be a common miscommunication between the sensor and the intuitive. Okay, of course, we define all these things and get into them in greater detail. Chapter 6, Archetypes, an area of my expertise as well. I'm not going to read these, but if you want to pause the video, you can check them out. I guess I'll read the archetypal child. The archetypal child symbolizes the world's endless capacity for the new. The archetypal child is expressed in us through our unending capacity to become more whole, to individuate, to become who we are meant to be. Anima and animus, the inner contrasexual opposite in us. You can read that. I'm not going to read it right now, but each of us carries that opposite figure inside of us. And I think in many ways, Jung was sort of a pioneer of the gender fluidity that we see today, seeing that even the most masculine man, as he says there, has a feminine soul and vice versa, that there is some way that these principles, of course, when Jungians say feminine and masculine, they don't mean male and female. They mean a larger principle closer to something like yin and yang, eros and logos, feeling and thinking in some ways. But there's a split within us, and we all tend to have, strengths up front and less developed parts underneath, and that is representative of that, spread of qualities inside us. We're not all everything. Everybody's coming from a place, and they're working to integrate more as they go through life. But perfection doesn't really exist for most people. Spider there. Okay, synchronicity, of course, one of the favorite parts of Jungian psychology. There's a great story that I saw Rick Tarnas tell at a conference that I put on in 2014 in Joshua Tree, where he told the story of a paper that was to be published. Um, and that he went into this meeting, this person had died, and they were meeting to see if this person's scientific paper should be published. Um, and Jung felt it shouldn't, and they had this meeting and it went on, and they realized that eventually that Jung's watch was off, and he had just had it at the watchmaker. And being Swiss, of course, this is very serious stuff. And so he took the metaphor of his watch being off as his attitude being off towards this paper. And he said, let's start the meeting all over again. And so at, age 75 or whatever age he was during that story, he's still looking for the unconscious to show him when he's not getting it. And I think that's profound, to have that kind of attitude of continually being a student to the greater forces within us throughout our whole life. Of course, synchronicity is a magical factor, and I'll read you the quote here from the book. Often synchronistic occurrences happen in situations charged with emotion, with affect, with feeling. Perhaps you run into a past lover traveling on the same path you had previously traveled together, and then you realize that you had taken the same trip with each other 10 years before to the day. Synchronicities often reflect powerful emotion realities inside us and suggest that we live in a world that seems built for them to happen, that values them and brings them into being. Appreciating them opens us up to a wider worldview, one in which reality is full of meaning, and that somehow spirit really is in matter. A much bigger worldview and a more accurate worldview than the dominant worldview of our time. More holistic one, more true one, a more feeling one. And as I said, I believe it's more accurate and more fulfilling to live in this Taoist appreciation of the mystery of the world. Answer to Job, one of the most important books that Jung wrote. I'm not going to read that part, but if you want to read that part, you can pause it and check it out. I guess I'll read this part. The thing that really struck me, and I come from a background in philosophy, and in philosophy there is no good explanation that I ever read for the existence of darkness and evil in the world. And Rivka Kluger, an Alexandrian student of Jung's with a doctoral degree in Semitic languages and history of religion, wrote that Jung described it to her this way: through the suffering that he inflicted upon Job out of his own nature, God has come to self-knowledge, and that is what redeems the man Job. This is really the solution to the enigma of Job. That is a true justification for Job's fate, in which without this background, would in its cruelty and injustice remain an open problem. Job appears here clearly as a sacrifice, but also as the carrier of the divine fate, and gives meaning to his suffering and liberation of his soul. So Jung felt, and this book came to him in a week of illness, and he wrote it in 1 week after a heart attack, and summarized his feeling that humanity plays a role in the divine drama, that moral action and coming to consciousness both serve the purpose of knitting together conscious and unconscious, not only in ourselves, but in the cosmos, in the world. And I think that, for me, is the ground upon which we find justification for moral action and the satisfaction that that gives us, the rightness that we feel about it. It's a big, big, heavy topic. We could talk about that more, but just a little taste. So the second appendix there is what I call a field guide to Jung today. And I'll read the first chapter, or the first paragraph. As mentioned in the introduction, the Jungian community is a worldwide organically growing phenomenon. The tradition of Jungian psychology is kept alive not only by analysts, psychotherapists, and their patients, but also by a broad network of organizations, academics, artists, writers, business people, theologians, scientists, and others. It includes millions of readers of the works, not only of Jung, but of the many influential authors who carried the approach forward in their own ways. The expanse of this great family is too vast to describe, but there are a few ongoing organizations that are at the center of Jungian life today. The backbone of this ecosystem are the institutes. And I'll just describe briefly. Jungian analysts, candidates for training to become a Jungian analyst, must have completed 100 hours of personal work with a Jungian analyst before they begin. 100 hours of psychotherapy. Once they're accepted into the training program, they must complete approximately another 350 hours of their own personal work. While the training of Jungian analysts also includes a tremendous amount of clinical work and academic education on par with most clinical psychological doctoral programs, its emphasis is upon wrestling with one's own material, and that makes Jungian analysis different from other psychologists. So I'm going to be also doing a course based on this book that you can find out more about at Jungian Online, with some great guest lecturers joining me, including 3 of the analysts on our team. Here's the schedule that we'll go through in the course, and the appearances of my great guests there as well. I'll let you pause that if you want to check it out. Here's the analysts that'll be joining me. And I wanted to leave you with a quote finally from Marie-Louise von Franz, the great Jungian analyst, perhaps the second greatest to Jung. She said, "If a man devotes himself to the instructions of his own unconscious, it can bestow this gift of renewal, so that suddenly life, which had been stale and dull, turns into a rich, unending inner adventure, full of creative possibilities." And so I would encourage you as well to consider working with an analyst online or where you are, and check out the course, as I mentioned. Uh, and check out the book as well. And I thank you, and I hope this was useful. And take care.